An arrangement when you went away, you were mine to subdue. Well, even despite our estrangement, I've got a small query for you. What comes next? You've been freed. Do you know how hard it is to lead? You're on your own. Awesome. Wow. Do you have a clue what happens now? Oceans rise, empires fall. It's much harder when it's all your call. All alone across the sea. When your people say they hate you, don't come crawling back to me. Da 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 da. You're on your own.
So that's King George expressing his skepticism as to whether the newly independent nation can survive. When independence was declared, it meant that the former colonies were leaving the British Empire. And the Declaration of Independence declared that the 13 colonies by right ought to be free and independent states. It didn't say anything about creating a unified new American nation. And that's because the new states were as dramatically different from each other as they were from England. And transportation and communication at that time was very primitive, and so allegiances tended to be local rather than national. And so creating a national government was really the last thing on the minds of the revolutionaries. Very few Americans thought continentally at that time. In fact, after the revolution, there was great suspicion against the tyranny of a powerful central government. That was the experience of the 13 colonies, that the British government was too powerful and that King George III was a tyrant. Therefore, after independence, they conceived of a government with a weak central force. So it was as if the country was now divided into 13 separate countries, which with each state having the balance of power and with a very weak central government. It was sort of a confederation like the European Union is today. And following independence, each state jealously guarded its self-rule and its sovereignty. But they did agree to join together in a league of friendship known as the Articles of Confederation. But again, it was a system with a weak central government. Each state had its own army. Each state had its own legislature, its own functioning courts, its own taxes. Each state could issue its own currency. There was no chief executive to enforce the laws. There was no court to interpret the laws. Congress didn't even have the power to tax. It could only request the states to supply funds. Congress couldn't raise an army. It could only request troops from the states. And Congress did not have the power to regulate commerce between the states. And any changes in this government required the approval of 9 out of the 13 states in order to pass the laws. So it really was an unworkable form of government. This cartoon sort of highlights the weakness of this government. It shows the Articles of Confederation as a ship that is being battered by waves that are the problems. No national court system, no power to enforce treaties, no power to collect taxes, etc. Now, unlike most Americans at the time, Hamilton thought it was a mistake to grant powers to the states at the expense of a central government. His experience in the American Revolution highlighted the problems of conducting a war without a strong central government. And so, for example, the Continental Congress was unable to furnish troops with adequate food or clothing. It failed to raise enough money to pay the troops. And during the war, it had to deal with the problem of mounting debt. And so Hamilton regarded this government under the Articles of Confederation inadequate to resolve the problems of the country. So while most people at the time thought locally, Hamilton argued that Americans needed to think continentally, that Americans had to be dispelled of the notion that political power was inherently evil. He took his seat at the Confederation Congress in 1792, the youngest delegate at the age of 27. And he immediately called for a revision of the Articles of Confederation. But his appeal fell on deaf ears. And so he was discouraged. He returned to New York to resume his law practice. But before leaving the Congress, he said, "Our prospects are not flattering. Every day proves the inefficiency of the present Confederation. We at the moment experience all the mischiefs of a bankrupted and ruined credit." And it was not long before Hamilton's concerns were realized. Settlers on the western frontier could no longer rely on a well-trained army when they were attacked by Native Americans. By 1787, the treasury was empty. Debts to foreign government and to American citizens could not be paid. Congress could not raise an army. Its only source of revenue was the generosity of the states, and no nation was willing to lend money to a country that could not honor its existing debts. And then in 1787, farmers in Western Massachusetts, led by Daniel Shays, rose up in rebellion against taxes. And the fear of anarchy and revolution was sweeping the country. In what is known as the Newburgh Conspiracy, the army threatened to mutiny in order to press Congress to pay its pensions. And that threat was only diffused when Washington intervened, appealing to the soldiers' sense of duty and honor. And in that, he reached for his glasses, saying that he had grown old and gray, virtually blind in the service of his country. And he said, as he put his glasses on, "Gentlemen, you must pardon me, for I have not only grown gray, but almost blind in the service of my country." And there wasn't a dry eye in the room, and the plan for the mutiny collapsed. Nevertheless, there was a general feeling that if nothing was done, the country would fall apart. The very future of the nation was in doubt. And so it was in that sense of crisis and doom that the Constitutional Convention met in the summer of 1787 to revise the Articles of Confederation. Now, Hamilton was one of 3 delegates from New York attending this Constitutional Convention. The other 2 delegates from New York did not want to alter the Articles of Confederation to any great degree. Hamilton, on the other hand, wanted to get rid of it entirely and replace it with a new form of government. Now, before we turn to the events at the Constitutional Convention, let's look at the relationship between Hamilton and Aaron Burr. From the outset of their careers, these 2 men lived parallel lives and often found themselves in competition with each other. They were a year apart in age, but their origins were very different. Burr came from a distinguished family which had arrived in America more than 100 years before Burr was born. He was the grandson of Calvinist preacher Jonathan Edwards and the son of the president of Princeton University. So unlike Hamilton, Burr grew up in wealth and privilege. But both Burr and Hamilton knew tragedy at an early age. Aaron Burr's father died when Aaron was only 19 months old. His grandfather and mother died a few months later, leaving Aaron Burr an orphan at the age of 2. Now, Hamilton also was an orphan, but both Burr and Hamilton were unusually bright, and they excelled in their studies. Burr graduated from Princeton after only 2 years of study, while Hamilton dropped out of King's College after 2.5 years to fight in the Revolutionary War. Both Hamilton and Burr served as colonels in the war. But while Washington embraced Hamilton, he took an instant dislike to Burr. Both men, Hamilton and Burr, fought in the same battle, the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse. Hamilton's horse was shot out from under him in that battle, just as Burr's horse was killed in the same battle. Whereas Hamilton remained in the war to the end and was the hero of Yorktown, Burr had resigned from the army 3 years before the British surrender. And their lives continued in parallel through the 1780s. Both started out as trial lawyers at the same time and had offices on the same street in New York City. Sometimes they even worked on the same team, but more often they were on opposing sides. Both were brilliant and ambitious, and because they lived in a very high style, they both often found themselves in debt. And during the 1780s, both put their law practices on hold in order to serve in the New York State Assembly. Like Hamilton, Burr was witty and urbane, but while Hamilton was outspoken to a fault, Burr was secretive. Hamilton was more of a statesman, while Burr reflected the qualities of a politician, evading clear-cut positions on most issues. Burr was more interested in politics rather than policy. He was an agile opportunist who could work both sides of the fence. For example, whereas Hamilton ardently opposed slavery, Burr found it politically expedient to abandon his abolitionist stance when he later allied himself with Thomas Jefferson. So there was a mutual respect between Hamilton and Burr, but also a noticeable mistrust. Burr considered Hamilton brilliant, but excessively vain and too opinionated. Hamilton regarded Burr as unprincipled and somewhat devious, and they differed over their philosophy of government. Hamilton saw the need for a stronger central government, but Burr, who had allied himself with New York's most powerful politician, Governor George Clinton, Burr and Clinton supported the Articles of Confederation, and Burr opposed the Constitutional Convention. Thus, the paths of Hamilton and Burr often crossed. And as you probably know, their paths would end in a fatal confrontation, but that will have to wait till Thursday night. In the song in the musical called Dear Theodosia, Hamilton and Burr welcomed their respective children, Theodosia and Philip, into the world, and they vowed to give their children a better childhood than their own. So we are now going to listen to the song Dear Theodosia.
Dear Theodosia, what to say to you? You have my eyes, you have your mother's name. When you came into the world, you cried, and it broke my heart. I'm dedicating every day to you. Domestic life was never quite my style. When you smile, you knock me out, I fall apart. and I thought I was so smart. You will come of age with our young nation. We'll bleed and fight for you. We'll make it right for you. If we lay a strong enough foundation, we'll pass it on to you. We'll give the world to you, and you'll blow us all away. Someday, someday. Yeah, you'll blow us all away. Someday, someday.
Oh, Philip, when you smile, I am undone. My son, look at my son. Pride is not the word I'm looking for. There is so much more inside me now. Oh, Philip, you outshine the morning sun. My son, when you smile, I fall apart, and I thought I was so smart. My father wasn't around. I swear that I'll be around for you. I'll do whatever it takes.
I'll make a million mistakes.
I'll make the world safe and sound for you. We'll come of age with our young nation. We'll bleed and fight for you. We'll make it right for you. If we lay a strong enough foundation, we'll pass it on to you. We'll give the world to you, and you'll blow us all away. Someday, someday. Yeah, you'll blow us all away. Someday, someday.
So Alexander Hamilton and his wife Eliza ultimately had 8 children together. They took up residency in Lower Manhattan. Philip, the firstborn, 1782, and you can see the other 7 children of the Hamilton family. The play doesn't even mention any children other than Philip, but they did have 8 altogether. And with the exception of Philip, the other 7 lived rather long lives. So it's ironic that Alexander Hamilton, who would be the architect of the American financial system, resided at 57 Wall Street for 7 years. That was his address. Now let's take a look at the nature of democracy in the late 18th century. In order to understand the nature of politics, then, we have to recognize that the founding fathers lived in a pre-modern world that cannot be understood in modern terms. The founding generation straddled an aristocratic world that was on the way out and a democratic world that was just emerging. That meant that politics in America was open to a whole class of talented white men, not women, but a class of talented white men who would have remained in obscurity in Europe because they lacked the proper bloodlines or inherited wealth. Hamilton could never have risen in the aristocratic hierarchy of European society. European society was like a pyramid, and you were born into a particular class, and it was almost impossible to move out of that class. And so it did not provide social mobility for people of talent like Alexander Hamilton. So the founding generation benefited from an American society that did reward talent rather than noble bloodlines. But it would be a mistake to conflate increased opportunity with democracy. Again, we have to try to understand the 18th century context. Then the term democracy was really a pejorative, a negative term, until the third decade of the 19th century. In the late 18th century, democracy meant mob rule. It meant giving power to the unwashed masses, and that majority opinion would then be manipulated by demagogues. In the 18th century, democracy meant refusal. People could refuse to pay taxes if they wanted. And it meant opposing any political authority that subordinated local interests into some larger national agenda. Now, Alexander Hamilton had a pessimistic view of human nature. Of all the founding fathers, he had the least trust in the wisdom of the masses. In fact, he had contempt for ordinary Americans and their democratic aspirations. He said, all communities divide themselves into the few and the many. The first, meaning the few, are the rich and well-born. The others are the mass of people. The people are turbulent and changing. They seldom judge or determine right. Give therefore to the first class, that is the wealthy, a distinct permanent share in the government. Now, this is a side of Hamilton that does not come out in the musical's can-do pro-immigrant hype. But Alexander Hamilton was not really a man of the people. He was an elitist. He didn't believe that a majority of the American citizens could be expected to subordinate their personal desires for the public good. So to guard against anarchy and tyranny, he proposed a form of government that would have the stability of a monarchy combined with the liberties of a republic. He suggested a government that would be led by a president and a senate that would be elected for life and not chosen by the mass of people, rather chosen by electors. Now, since the proceedings at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787 were held in secrecy, rumors began to spread that Hamilton was actually proposing a hereditary monarchy, but that wasn't true. While his proposals were atrociously misguided, he was not calling for a monarchical system. He did not support a hereditary chief executive. Moreover, his plan called for a president who would serve only as long as Congress approved of him. And Hamilton never supported a nobility or hereditary titles or any other trappings of aristocracy. But despite that, till the end of his days, his detractors insisted that he was a traitor who wanted to import the British system to America. Those at the convention who supported the rights of states against the power of the central government, they particularly vilified Hamilton. Newspaper articles portrayed Hamilton as a character labeled Tom Shit, a bastard of mixed racial origins. Hamilton was accused of being an arrogant blowhard and a pompous charlatan. The fact is, the vast majority of American political leaders were afraid of unbridled democracy, but they all believed that the foundation for the new government should be based on popular support. But the big conflict at the Constitutional Convention was not between aristocracy and democracy, but rather between those who supported a strong central government versus those who felt that the bulk of political power should remain with the states. Now, Hamilton was at a difficult position in the Constitutional Convention. As I mentioned, he was one of 3 delegates from New York, but the other 2 delegates strongly opposed Hamilton's agenda for a strong and powerful central government. Hamilton played a surprisingly small part in the debates at the convention, partly because he was frequently absent on legal business, and also because his extreme nationalism put him at odds with most of the delegates who were reluctant to cede power to the central government. The deliberations in Philadelphia produced a constitution that was a bundle of compromises between those who supported a powerful central government and those who opposed it. It provided for a federal system which delegated significant authority to a central Congress, but which also reserved many other powers to the states. And so in this Venn diagram, you can see that the Constitution granted the powers in blue to the federal Congress, and the powers in yellow were reserved to the states. And there were some powers that were both shared by the federal and state governments, such as the power to levy taxes and to charter banks. The new Constitution also provided for a system of checks and balances to prevent any one branch of government from wielding too much power. Now, while Hamilton approved of the decisions made by the delegates at the convention, he took exception to two issues in the new Constitution: immigration and slavery. He opposed any attempt to restrict membership in Congress to only native-born Americans. He also opposed any residency requirement for immigrants to qualify for serving in the state legislature, but he was overruled. And so the residency requirements for serving in the House of Representatives was 7 years, 9 years for senators and 14 years for a president. Also, the president was required to be a natural-born citizen or a citizen at the time of the adoption of the Constitution. Now that meant that Hamilton was a citizen, because even though he was not a natural-born citizen, he was a citizen at the time of the adoption of the Constitution. So Hamilton could have run for president had he so desired. Now, Hamilton also objected to the decision to avoid the issue of slavery at the Constitutional Convention. The slavery issue was so explosive that it did not allow for any room for compromise. Had members suggested that slavery be abolished, then the Southern states would not have signed on to the new Constitution. And so as a result, the very word federal slavery does not even appear in the Constitution. The Constitution was ultimately put before the states for ratification. Those who supported this Constitution were called Federalists. Those who opposed it were called Anti-Federalists. The country was sharply divided between Federalists such as Hamilton and James Madison, who urged ratification, and those Anti-Federalists who feared that the new Constitution gave too much power to the federal government. Now, while Hamilton did not engage in many of the deliberations in Philadelphia, his role in the adoption of the Constitution was absolutely crucial. At the convention, he made long speeches defending the new Constitution, clause by clause. In 1787 and 1788, he worked with John Jay and James Madison to write a series of 85 essays in support of the new Constitution. The articles were collectively known as the Federalist Papers, and it proved critical in achieving the ratification of the Constitution. Now, the authors of the Constitution wrote 85 essays, but Hamilton himself wrote 51 of the 85 in just 6 months. Collectively, these Federalist Papers are regarded by scholars as both a literary and political masterpiece, a classic of political literature that has now become required reading in many government classes today. And the Federalist Papers have been cited about 300 times over the past 2 centuries by the Supreme Court, more than any other document. Opposition to the new Constitution evaporated in the face of Hamilton's supreme logic and persuasive abilities. With his brilliance and with the sheer force of his personality, Hamilton won the battle, and the Constitution was ultimately approved and adopted by every state. So it's ironic that it took an outsider to unite the United States. But while the smartest man in the room is always admired, he is seldomly liked. He's always respected, but often he is feared. So it should come as no surprise that Hamilton made many enemies at this time. And the musical goes over all of these developments in the song that is entitled Non-Stop.
After the war, I went back to New York.
After the war, I went back to New York.
I finished up my studies and I practiced law.
I practiced law, Burr worked next door.
Even though we started at the very same time, Alexander Hamilton began to climb. How to account for his rise to the top? Man, the man is non-stop.
Gentlemen of the jury, I'm curious, bear with me. Are you aware that we're making history? This is the first murder trial of our brand new nation, the liberty behind deliberation. I intend to prove beyond the shadow of a doubt with my assistant counsel.
Co-counsel Hamilton, sit down. Our client Larry Weeks is innocent. Call your first witness. That's all you had to say.
Okay, one more thing.
Why do you assume you're the smartest in the room? Why do you assume you're the smartest in the room? Why do you assume you're the smartest in the room? Assume that attitude may be your doom. Why do you write like you're running out of time? Write day and night like you're running out of time. Every day you fight like you're running out of time. Keep on fighting in the meantime.
Non-stop. Corruption's such an old song that we can sing along in harmony. And nowhere is it stronger than in Albany. As colonies, economies increasingly stalling, and honestly, that's why public service seems to be calling me. I practiced the law, practically perfected it. I've seen injustice in the world and I've corrected it. Now for a strong central democracy. If not, then I'll be Socrates throwing verbal rocks at these mediocrities.
Hamilton at the Constitutional Convention.
I was chosen for the Constitutional Convention.
There is a New York junior delegate.
Now what I'm gonna say may sound indelicate.
Goes and proposes his own form of government. His own plan for a new form of government. Talks for 6 hours. The convention is listless.
Bright young man.
Yo, who the F is this?
Why do you always say what you believe? Why do you always say what you believe? Every proclamation guarantees free ammunition for your enemies. Why do you write like it's going out of style? Write day and night like it's going out of style. Every day you fight like it's going out of style. Do what you do. Alexander?
Aaron Burr, sir.
Well, it's the middle of the night.
Can we confer, sir?
Is this a legal matter?
Yes, and it's important to me.
What do you need?
Burr, you're a better lawyer than me.
Okay.
I know I talk too much. I'm abrasive. You're incredible in court. You're succinct, persuasive. My client needs a strong defense. You're the solution.
Who's your client?
The new U.S. Constitution?
No.
Hear me out.
No way.
A series of essays anonymously published defending the document to the public.
No one will read it.
I disagree.
And if it fails?
Burr, that's why we need it.
The Constitution's a mess.
So it needs amendments.
It's full of contradictions.
So is independence. We have to start somewhere.
No. No way.
You're making a mistake.
Good night.
Hey, what are you waiting for? What do you stall for?
What?
We won the war. What was it all for? Do you support this Constitution?
Of course.
Then defend it.
And what if you're backing the wrong horse?
Burr, we studied and we fought and we killed for the notion of a nation we now get to build. For once in your life, take a stand with pride. I don't understand how you stand to the side.
I'll keep all my plans close to my chest. I'll wait here and see which way the wind will blow. I'm taking my time watching the afterbirth of a nation, watching the tension grow.
I am sailing off to London. I am accompanied by someone who always pays. I have found a wealthy husband who will keep me in comfort for all my days. He is not a lot of fun, but there's no one who can match you for turn of phrase. My Alexander, don't forget to ride. Look at where you are.
Alexander joins forces with James Madison and John Jay to write a series of essays defending the new United States Constitution entitled the Federalist Papers. The plan was to write a total of 25 essays, the work divided evenly among the three men. In the end, they wrote 85 essays in the span of 6 months. John Jay got sick after writing 5. James Madison wrote 29. Hamilton wrote the other 51. How do you write like you're running out of time? Write day and night like you're running out of time. Every day you fight like you're running out of time. Like you're running out of time. Are you running out of time? How do you write like tomorrow won't arrive? How do you write like you need it to survive? How do you write every second you're alive? Every second you're alive. Every second you're alive.
They're asking me to lead. I'm doing the best I can to get the people that I need. I'm asking you to be my right hand, Treasury man. Or state. I know it's a lot to ask. Treasury or state. To leave behind the world, you know. Sir, do you want me to run the Treasury or State Department? Treasury. Let's go.
Alexander.
I have to leave.
Alexander.
Look around at how lucky we are to be alive right now.
Helpless.
They are asking me to leave.
Look around. Isn't this enough? He will never be satisfied. He will never be satisfied. Satisfied.
History has I am not throwing away my shot. I am Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton, just you wait. I am not throwing away my shot.
With the Constitution ratified, Hamilton took the lead to ensure that the new federal government would be administered by men of talent. He understood that there was only one man capable of transcending the local, state, and regional divisions, an utterly indispensable individual whom every American recognized and admired, and that man was George Washington. But the only man in America who didn't share that presumption was Washington himself. After presiding over the Constitutional Convention, Washington was determined to retire to his beloved estate in Mount Vernon. He insisted, "I have no wish which aspires beyond the humble and happy lot of living and dying a private person on my farm." Nevertheless, Hamilton prodded, cajoled, and pleaded with Washington to head the new government. He made it clear to Washington that no man in America was so essential to the success of the emerging nation, and, quote, "no other man can sufficiently unite public opinion or give the requisite weight to the office in the commencement of the government." And so Washington finally relented and agreed to run for president. Hamilton was confident that Washington would win the first presidential election, but virtual certainty wasn't enough for Hamilton. He was convinced that Washington's election was so essential for the American experiment to succeed that he decided to take no chances. He set about to rig the first presidential election in American history. Under the Constitution, presidential electors cast 2 votes apiece, but they didn't vote separately for president and vice president. Whoever earned the most electoral votes became president, and the runner-up became vice president. And so Hamilton recognized that Washington's only rival was John Adams. And so Hamilton lobbied with the electors in order to get them to deny their votes to Adams. In the end, it made no difference. Washington was the unanimous choice of the electors, and Adams, who finished second, became vice president. But Hamilton's intervention on behalf of Washington exacted a price. Washington would have been outraged that Hamilton had stained his election. And Adams deeply resented Hamilton's actions as unforgivable deceit. And that's when he referred to Hamilton as that bastard brat of a Scottish peddler. His ambition, his restlessness, and all his grandiose schemes come, I'm convinced, from a superabundance of secretions which he couldn't find enough whores to absorb. But such criticism didn't faze Hamilton as long as Washington headed the new ship of state. The greatest challenge facing the new republic was its precarious financial state. The credit of the nation was in ruin. The national debt was growing, and there were different types of debts. There were debts that states had incurred during the Revolutionary War. There were debts that the government had incurred under the Articles of Confederation. And there were debts in the form of bonds that was sold to American citizens during the Revolutionary War. And the government did not have enough money during the Articles of Confederation to pay back these debts. Now, the new government lacked a revenue source to pay these debts. Now, the Constitution made no mention of a cabinet, but soon after Washington was sworn in as president, he appointed Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury because he thought Hamilton could come up with a program to resolve these financial problems. Hamilton recognized that the future of the country lay in business and industry rather than agriculture. And he understood that to develop into an industrial power, America would need a powerful economic system. But during the Revolution and in the years that followed, the economy was in shambles. To finance the Revolutionary War, the government borrowed some $80 million from other countries, as well as borrowing money from Americans who purchased government bonds. And so, in his position as Secretary of the Treasury, Hamilton tried to solve these problems. Taxes were a major reason for throwing off British rule, but Hamilton understood that taxes were a necessary evil, and so he developed a plan that would pay off America's debt and would set the nation on a course for an economically prosperous future. He believed in the trickle-down theory before there was a trickle-down theory. His financial policy was based on the philosophy that government should support the richest elements in society, which over time, he felt, would benefit all Americans. Hamilton's course of action, delivered to the House of Representatives in his report on credit in January of 1790, had three major planks. First, the government should pay off the war bonds it had issued. Hamilton felt that unless the debt was paid off, the United States would never be able to borrow money again, and that would weaken it as a great power. To fail to pay debts, he argued, would establish the federal government as a bad debtor. But his plan was bitterly opposed by many bondholders. Why? Because when these bondholders bought the bonds, they soon became skeptical that the government would ever honor the certificates. And so they sold them to speculators at a fraction of their worth. And so if the government now repaid the debt at full value, that would benefit the speculators, critics charged. But that was precisely what Hamilton intended, to reward wealthy speculators so they would support the new nation. A second part of Hamilton's report on credit was that the federal government should assume the debts that were incurred by the states. But the federal assumption of state debts was very controversial because some states, particularly in the South, had already paid off their war debts, but other states in the North had not. And so Southerners complained, since they already paid off their debts, why should they contribute to paying off the debts of Northern states? Virginia was the state most opposed to the assumption of state debts by the federal government. Finally, Hamilton proposed that the government should establish a steady revenue stream by taxing imported goods and by taxing whiskey. Now, critics pointed out that Hamilton's plan favored the rich at the expense of the poor. Taxing imports through a tariff would protect American businesses from foreign competition, but that would also mean less competition, which would bring higher prices for consumers. And the whiskey tax hurt small farmers who raised grain that they then converted into whiskey. For months, Hamilton's proposals languished in Congress. The final sticking point was the federal assumption of state debts. And so that's the background to the song in the musical called Cabinet Battle Number 1. And so we are going to turn to that.
17.
Ladies and gentlemen, you could have been anywhere in the world tonight, but you're here with us in New York City. Are you ready for a cabinet meeting, huh? The issue on the table: Secretary Hamilton's plan to assume state debt and establish a national bank. Secretary Jefferson, you have the floor, sir.
Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We fought for these ideals, we shouldn't settle for less. These are wise words, enterprising men quote them. Don't act surprised, you guys, cause I wrote them. Ow, but Hamilton forgets. His plan would have the government assume state debts. Now place your bets as to who that benefits. The very seat of government where Hamilton sits.
Not true.
Oh, if the shoe fits, wear it. If New York's in debt, why should Virginia bear it? Our debts are paid, I'm afraid. Don't tax the South, cause we got it made in the shade. In Virginia, we plant seeds in the ground. We create. You just wanna move our money around. This financial plan is an outrageous demand, and it's too many damn pages for any man to understand. Stand with me in the land of the free. Pray to God we never see Hamilton's candidacy. Look, when Britain taxed our tea, we got frisky. Imagine what gon' happen when you try to tax our whiskey.
Thank you, Secretary Jefferson. Secretary Hamilton, your response.
Thomas, that was a real nice declaration. Welcome to the present, we're running a real nation. Would you like to join us? Or stay mellow, doing whatever the hell it is you do in Monticello? If we assume the debts the union gets, a new line of credit, a financial diuretic, how do you not get it? If we're aggressive and competitive, the union gets a boost, you'd rather give it a sedative? A civics lesson from a slaver. Hey neighbor, your debts are paid cause you don't pay for labor. We plant seeds in the South, we create, they keep ranting. We know who's really doing the planting. And another thing, Mr. Age of Enlightenment, don't lecture me about the war, you didn't fight in it. You think I'm frightened of you, man? We almost died in the trench while you were off getting high with the French. Thomas Jefferson always hesitant with the president, reticent. There isn't a plan he doesn't jettison. Madison, you mad as a hatter, so take your medicine. Damn, you in worse shape than the national debt is in. Sitting there useless as two shits. Hey, turn around, bend over, I'll show you where my shoe fits.
Excuse me. Madison, Jefferson, take a walk. Hamilton, take a walk. We're gonna reconvene after a brief recess. Hamilton,
Sir?
a word.
You don't have the votes.
You don't have the votes. You're gonna need congressional approval, and you don't have the votes. Such a blunder, sometimes it makes me wonder why I even bring the thunder.
Why he even brings the thunder?
You want to pull yourself together?
I'm sorry, these Virginians are birds of a feather.
Young man, I'm from Virginia, so watch your mouth.
So we let Congress get held hostage by the South?
You need the votes.
No, we need bold strokes. We need this
No,
plan.
you need to convince more folks.
Well, James Madison won't talk to me. That's a non-starter.
Winning was easy, young man. Governing's
They're
hard.
being intransigent.
You have to find a compromise.
But they don't have a plan. They just hate mine.
Convince them otherwise.
And what happens if I don't get congressional approval?
I imagine they'll call for your removal.
Sir,
Figure it out, Alexander. That's an order from your commander.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Good. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 6, 7, 8.
Ladies and...
Okay. So, Virginians were also unsettled about the plan to locate the federal capital in New York City. Hamilton, a New Yorker, wanted the capital in New York City. In fact, he was so closely connected with the city, some people referred to New York as Hamiltonopolis. But Hamilton realized he could use this issue as leverage. The issue was resolved when Hamilton, Jefferson, and Madison met at what became the most consequential meal in American history. It was known as the dinner table compromise. I got ahead of myself here. And at this dinner, it was agreed that Virginians would support Hamilton's plan for the federal government to assume state debts. In return, Hamilton agreed that the capital of the United States would be moved from New York to just outside Virginia on the Potomac River. And so, with the backing of Virginia, Hamilton's proposed plan for financial credit was approved. And that is the background to the next number in Hamilton called The Room Where It Happened.
Ah, Mr. Secretary.
Mr. Burr, sir.
Hey, did you hear the news about good old General Mercer?
No.
You know Claremont Street?
Yeah.
They renamed it after him. The Mercer legacy is secure.
Sure.
And all he had to do was die.
Yeah, that's a lot less work.
We ought to give it a try. Now, how you gonna get your debt plan through?
I guess I'm gonna finally have to listen to you.
Really?
Talk less, smile more, do whatever it takes to get my plan on the Congress floor.
Now, Madison and Jefferson are merciless.
Well, hate the sin, love the sinner.
Hamilton.
I'm sorry, Burr, I gotta go.
But
Decisions are happening over dinner.
two Virginians and an immigrant walk into a room diametrically opposed foes. They emerged with a compromise, having opened doors that were previously closed. Bros. The immigrant emerges with unprecedented financial power, a system he can shape however he wants. The Virginians emerge with the nation's capital. And here's the pièce de résistance. No one else was in the room where it happened, the room where it happened, the room where it happened. No one else was in the room where it happened, the room where it happened, the room where it happened. No one really knows how the game is played, the art of the trade, how the sausage gets made. We just assume that it happens, but no one else is in the room where it happens. Thomas claims
Alexander was on Washington's doorstep one day in distress and disarray.
Thomas claims
Alexander said,
I've nowhere else to turn.
and basically begged me to join the fray.
Thomas claims
I approached Madison and said, I know you hate him, but let's hear what he has to say.
Thomas claims
Well, I arranged the meeting. I arranged the menu, the venue, the seating.
But no one else was in the room where it happened, the room where it happened, the room where it happened. No one else was in the room where it happened, the room where it happened, the room where it happened. No one really knows how the parties get to yes. The pieces that are sacrificed in every game of chess. We just assume that it happens, but no one else is in the room where it happens. Meanwhile, Madison is grappling with the fact that not every issue can be settled by committee. Meanwhile, Congress is fighting over where to put the capital. It isn't pretty. Then Jefferson approaches with the dinner and invite, and Madison responds with Virginian insight.
Maybe we can solve one problem with another and win a victory for the Southerners. In other words, a quid pro quo.
I suppose.
Wouldn't you like to work a little closer to home?
Actually, I would.
Well, I propose the Potomac.
And you'll provide him his votes.
Well, we'll see how it goes.
Let's go.
No one else was in the room where it happened, the room where it happened, the room where it happened. No one else was in the room where it happened, the room where it happened, the room where it happened. My God, in God we trust, but we never really know what got discussed. Click, boom, and it happened. And no one else is in the room where it happened. Alexander Hamilton, what did they to sail New York City down the river.
Alexander Hamilton.
Did Washington know about the dinner? Was there presidential pressure to deliver?
Alexander Hamilton.
Or did you know even then it doesn't matter where you put the U.S. Capitol?
Cause we'll have the banks, we're in the same spot.
You got more than you gave.
And I wanted what I got. When you got skin in the game, you stay in the game. But you don't get a win unless you play in the game. Oh, you get love for it, you get hate for it, you get nothing if you wait for it, wait for it, wait. God help and forgive me, I wanna build something that's gonna outlive me. What do you want, Bert? What do you want, Bert? If you stand for nothing, Bert, what do you fall for?
I wanna be in the room where it happens, the room where it happens. I wanna be in the room where it happens, the room where it happens. I wanna be in where it happens, the room where it happens. I wanna be in the room where it happens, the room where it happens. Close your eyes.
We want our leaders to save the day.
We don't get a say in what they trade away.
We dream of a brand new start.
But we dream in the dark for the most part. Dark as the tomb where it happens. I've got to be in the room. I've got to be where it happens. I've got to be where it happens. I've got to be in the room where it happens. I gotta be where it happens. Click, boom.
So, because of this dinner meeting, Hamilton got what he wanted. He got Virginia to agree to the federal assumption of state debts, and Virginia got what it wanted, which was to move the capital from New York City to outside of Virginia. Now, Hamilton's economic wizardry was not yet finished. Later in 1790, he proposed the creation of a federal bank. Just 1 second. As Secretary of the Treasury, he founded a national bank that would serve as a repository of government's funds and which also could make loans. Now, to opponents, local and state banks were fine, but a central bank would be far away from many parts of the nation. And so how would people in Georgia, for example, be certain that the national bank would be looking out after their interests? And Jeffersonians objected that a national bank might serve the interests of only wealthy northern business and commercial interests. And since the Constitution made no mention of a national bank, its establishment represented a dangerous expansion of federal power, according to Jefferson and his followers. But Hamilton won the approval of Congress. Supporters claim that Hamilton developed a sound monetary policy that rescued the United States from financial ruin and set the course for a prosperous future. But critics charge that Hamilton's policies only transferred wealth from ordinary people to the elite. And so his program of taxation was not widely popular. Then in 1791, a revolt arose in Western Pennsylvania as a protest against the tax on whiskey. And that was the type of mob action that Hamilton feared. Now, I'm going to go ahead. It was called the Whiskey Rebellion. And Hamilton and President Washington, once again, put on their military uniforms and led a militia to suppress this whiskey rebellion of farmers in Western Pennsylvania. Supporters credited Hamilton for saving the nation from anarchy, while critics condemned him for crushing a protest by a few miserable farmers and frontiersmen in order to serve the interests of the financial elite. Now, it's at this point in the musical that we get some insight into Hamilton's personal life as he busies himself with the duties of government. In the number Take a Break, we are introduced to Hamilton's son, Philip, who was 9 years old in 1791. Eliza encourages her husband to spend quality time with the family. And Hamilton, in this song, compares himself to Macbeth in his struggles with Jefferson and Madison. And this song also hints at Hamilton's complicated relationship with his sister-in-law, Angelica. So now we are going to listen to the song, Take a Break.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Good. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
7, 8, 9.
7, 8, 9.
7, 8, 9.
7, 8, 9.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. My dearest Angelica, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day. I trust you'll understand the reference to another Scottish tragedy with...
I'm sorry. I misplaced the lyrics to Take a Break. So I think it's probably a good idea at this time to take a break. And tomorrow I will have those lyrics for you. So we covered a lot of ground. And at this point, we will